On a quiet afternoon in Winterfall Valley, after 10 long days working at a rescue camp, veteran Jack Carter finally returned home with his loyal dog Rex by his side. But the moment he opened the door, something was wrong. Strands of hair were scattered across the floor, and Rex froze, growling low before pulling Jack toward the backyard. There, on the sunlit grass, his 5-year-old daughter sat sobbing while her stepmother towered over her, shouting, a pair of sharp scissors cutting through chunks of the child's hair. In a single heartbeat, a father's voice became a shield, and a dog's roar rose like a wall between hurt and hope. What happened next may break your heart and make you believe in second chances again. Stay with us through this story to witness how love can pull a child out of her darkest moments. Wishing you a peaceful day filled with kindness. The late afternoon sunlight drifted softly over the quiet suburb of Winterfall Valley, touching the rooftops with a warm glow that made every shadow look gentler than it really was. Inside one of those modest single-family homes, however, peace was nowhere to be found. Vanessa Holt, 35, tall and sharply dressed in a fitted red sweater that clung to her rigid posture, stood in the living room with a look of disgust tightening her features. On the hardwood floor at her feet lay scattered strands of pale blonde hair. They belonged to Emily, the 5-year-old child whose tiny shoulders quivered as she stood nearby, her polka-dot dress smudged with the dust of a long day and her wide blue eyes clouded with dread. Vanessa's voice rose in sharp, cutting waves as she accused the child of being filthy, of shedding hair like an animal, of making her home unclean. To a child Emily's age, small, thin, still learning to understand the world, every cruel word landed like a blow. The anger inside Vanessa escalated quickly, as it often did when something felt out of her control. In one swift motion, she grabbed a handful of Emily's soft blonde hair, tugging the girl forward with a force that made her cry out. Without waiting for breath or reason, she dragged Emily through the back door and into the yard where the grass glowed green beneath the sun. There, under the open sky, Vanessa lifted a pair of metal scissors with blades that flashed in the light and began hacking away at the hair she claimed was making a mess. Emily sobbed and raised her small hands in a futile attempt to shield herself, but Vanessa's grip stayed firm, her temper spilling into the quiet neighborhood. A couple of neighbors across the fence paused, watching long enough to understand entirely what they were witnessing, then turned away, as if silence could free them from responsibility. It was at that very hour that a dusty Jeep rolled slowly into the driveway. Jack Carter, 42, stepped out, the weariness of 10 long days away etched faintly across his face. He was a tall man with the quiet solidity of someone shaped by service. Broad-shouldered, a trace of silver at the edge of his short hair, his olive-green field jacket and black baseball cap still carrying the scent of the rescue camp he had been working at. By his side hopped down Rex, his retired military K-9 partner, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a black and tan coat and sharp, intelligent eyes that rarely missed anything. Jack expected to open the door to the warmth of home, perhaps the sound of his daughter's laughter drifting from somewhere inside, but the stillness struck him as odd. Before he could take another step, Rex stiffened, his posture tense, ears pricked sharply toward the backyard. A low growl rolled up from deep within the dog's chest, a sound Jack had learned long ago never to ignore. Within seconds, Rex broke into a sprint, his paws beating against the concrete walkway as he rushed toward the back of the house. Jack didn't call out. His instincts rose faster than words, pushing him into motion as he followed the dog across the yard. The moment he rounded the corner, the scene before him carved itself into his memory with the precision of a blade. Vanessa stood over Emily in the middle of the lawn, one hand twisted hard in the little girl's hair, the other striking down with those sharp scissors, cutting indiscriminately while her voice rattled the air with rage and humiliation. Emily sat frozen on a small wooden chair, dirt streaked on her tiny legs, tears carving paths down her cheeks as she choked out broken pleas for it to stop. Rex reached them first. With a roar that seemed too deep for one dog to hold, he threw himself between Vanessa and Emily, his body lowered protectively, teeth bared not in wildness, but in warning. The suddenness of it forced Vanessa backward, shock flashing across her face as she stumbled a step away from the child she had been gripping moments before. The scissors trembled in her hand, not with guilt, but with a fear she had never expected to feel in her own backyard. Behind Rex, Jack arrived breathless, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the run. His gaze swept from the fallen locks of hair to his daughter's trembling form, and something inside him hardened, the kind of stillness that comes when a man sees a truth he can never unsee again. Jack did not shout at first. His voice came out low and steady as he scooped Emily into his arms, pressing her small body against his chest. She clung to him tightly, her sobs muffled against his jacket, her breath shaking with the force of all she had tried to endure silently. When he finally looked at Vanessa, the question he asked was simple, stripped of anything but disbelief. "What are you doing?" Vanessa's explanation spilled out immediately, rapid and defensive. She claimed she was only trying to tidy Emily's hair, that the girl had made a mess, that Jack was overreacting. But the scissors were still in her hand, and the patches of unevenly cut hair on Emily's head spoke more honestly than her words ever could. Jack said nothing more. He carried Emily past Vanessa, past the yard where the peace of the afternoon had been torn apart, past the neighbors who pretended they couldn't hear the child's cries. Rex stayed close at his heels, glancing back only once with a soft growl that needed no translation. Inside the Jeep, Jack held Emily while Rex settled near her feet, his dark eyes following the rise and fall of her small chest as she tried to breathe. Jack drove straight to the hospital, every mile tightening the knot in his chest. Emily's head rested against his jacket, exhausted from the storm she had been forced to weather. At the hospital, a middle-aged pediatrician with gentle hands examined Emily carefully. Under the bright overhead lights, the truth of what had been happening revealed itself in bruises too old to be accidents, faint marks along her ribs that suggested the impact of earlier blows, and small abrasions along her arms where someone had yanked her harder than a child should ever be handled. Jack stood by silently, his jaw clenched, every revelation feeling like a blow landing directly against his ribs. He wanted to believe this was the first time, but nothing on Emily's fragile little body aligned with that hope. When the examination was done, Emily sat on the edge of the hospital bed, her feet dangling, her eyes fixed on her hands as if she were afraid even to breathe too loudly. Jack knelt beside her, his presence steady, and for a moment she only stared at him, unsure if she was allowed to speak the truth she carried. Then, in a voice thin as paper, she whispered the words that settled the matter forever. "Stepmom said I'm not allowed to tell, or she'll leave me in the woods." The fear in her eyes was deeper than childhood fear. It was the fear of someone who had been threatened before and had believed it because she had no one else to hold on to. Jack gathered her gently into his arms, her small frame folding easily into his, and he held her without speaking, because no words could untangle what had been done or take away the terror she had felt. Rex lifted his head from the floor, nudging Emily's leg once with his warm muzzle, offering comfort in the only language a dog knows: presence. The room seemed to quiet around them, as if bearing witness to a truth that demanded reverence. There was no going back to the moment before he had stepped into the yard. No forgetting the sound of scissors slicing through a child's hair. No pretending the bruises were just bruises. When Jack finally rose, Emily curled into his shoulder, heavier with exhaustion than weight, and Rex followed with a slow, steady tread. The sun outside was beginning to soften into evening, though Jack barely noticed it as he carried his daughter out of the hospital doors. The day had begun like any other, bright and ordinary, but it had revealed a darkness he could no longer ignore. Holding Emily close, he stepped out into the quiet street with a certainty that whatever came next, the line had been drawn, and he would stand on the side where his daughter would never again have to face that kind of fear alone. The morning after the hospital visit arrived quietly, as if the town of Winterfall Valley wished to soften the weight resting on the small family's shoulders. Yet the calm could not disguise the steady hum of consequence that had already begun to move beneath the surface. A pale layer of mist clung to the lawns lining the neighborhood streets, drifting like a thin veil over a place that preferred to keep its troubles hidden. But the officers who came knocking were not interested in stillness or in sparing anyone's comfort. They stepped inside with professionalism instead of judgment, bringing with them a clipboard of routine questions and an air that suggested they had seen enough harm in their career to recognize when a child's pain required more than a passing glance. Jack Carter answered their inquiries with a level tone, not out of calmness, but out of a quiet determination he could not shake, and the officers listened closely as the pieces began forming a shape no parent ever wants to recognize. The scent of antiseptic still lingered faintly on Emily's clothes, and Rex lay beside her on the couch, his presence grounding, watchful, almost solemn. The detectives assigned to the case came later that afternoon, one of them a man named Sergeant Louis Merrill, 50, with deep lines carved by years of fatigue around his eyes, and the other, a younger woman named Officer Donna Crowley, 29, quick-thinking, tidy brown hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun, and a notebook that rarely left her hand. While Merrill carried himself with the weary steadiness of someone who had seen too much suffering to romanticize any of it, Crowley moved with a kind of sharp, attentive energy, her gaze sweeping the room as though reading stories and details most would overlook. They asked Jack for permission to review the medical report, then gently motioned for Emily to stay where she felt safest while they spoke with her father. The air grew heavy in the living room as Merrill flipped through the photographs handed to him by the hospital staff earlier that morning, each one a quiet testament to harm inflicted over time. No raised voices, no dramatic reactions, just a solemn nod that confirmed the pain on Emily's body aligned with a pattern no decent person could ignore. Once the officers compared Emily's injuries with the dates of Jack's recent absences, the match became unmistakable. The bruises, the abrasions, the hair pulled too hard, they aligned precisely with the 10 days he had been away before returning home. Officer Crowley made note of the timeline, her pen moving in clean, decisive strokes, while Merrill reminded Jack gently that patterns like these were almost never accidental. Rex, sensing the shift in the room, raised his head from where he rested and watched the officers with calm caution, his ears tilting slightly every time the word injury or harm was mentioned. Jack answered every question with clarity, though he found himself pausing more than once as memories of Vanessa's recent behavior flickered back into view, now painted in a light he wished he had noticed earlier. He recalled the excuses she made, the sudden fatigue, the desire to stay home, the insistence that she simply needed time alone, all of it seeming harmless then, but now taking on a harsher silhouette. Later that day, after the officers left to begin the formal process of their investigation, Rex became unusually restless, pacing near the sliding door that opened to the backyard. Jack opened it for him, thinking the dog needed fresh air, but the moment the latch clicked, Rex darted into the grass with the determination of someone tracking a scent too important to ignore. Jack followed slowly, watching as the German shepherd, muscular, alert, always more intuitive than most humans, circled the yard, sniffing near the bushes lining the fence. Then, Rex stopped at a particular patch of overgrown shrubs, let out a low rumble, and nosed forward into a narrow space, his tail stiff with focus. Jack crouched beside him and pulled aside a cluster of branches, revealing a small black trash bag, knotted tightly as though someone had wanted it hidden. Inside the bag lay clumps of hair, more than Jack wanted to see, tangled together with the torn remains of a little polka-dot dress Emily had outgrown months earlier, but had kept because she loved the color. Mixed in with those items was something that did not belong at all, a small, crumpled slip of paper from a pawnshop on the edge of town, bearing Vanessa's name in handwriting that was unmistakably hers. The paper listed an unpaid balance, small enough to seem trivial at first glance, yet meaningful enough for Jack to recognize it as a thread tugging at another part of Vanessa's life he had never been allowed to see. He folded the paper silently, feeling a dull ache press against the center of his chest as Rex nudged the dress gently, as though sensing the significance of what they had found. What struck Jack most was not the existence of the items, but the deliberate way they had been buried, hidden from sight, prepared not for disposal but for avoidance. When the officers returned the next morning to check on Emily and gather more information, Jack showed them the bag. Officer Crowley examined the contents with careful gloved hands, her brows knitting when she reached the pawn slip. She recognized the shop name, a small, dimly lit place known for dealing with people in desperate financial circumstances. Merrill, meanwhile, bagged the items with slow precision, murmuring that the combination of hair, torn clothing, and financial paperwork painted a picture most courts would take seriously. Emily, who sat at the kitchen table, tracing circles with her fingertip on a napkin, glanced up every few moments at the adult's solemn expressions. Jack reassured her softly, resting a hand on her back, and Rex settled beside her once again, his steady, breathing a quiet reassurance that she was not alone. An hour after the officers left, two neighbors stopped by. Mrs. Redmond, 62, thin-framed with soft gray hair, and her husband Harold, a retired mechanic with a gait slowed by old knee injuries. They stood on the porch, discomfort evident on their faces as they admitted they had heard Emily crying on multiple occasions in the past weeks. Mrs. Redmond confessed she had even seen Vanessa dragging the girl across the yard once, but every time she had expressed concern, Vanessa dismissed her with the same explanation. "She's just being naughty." Harold shifted uneasily, adding that they had not wanted to interfere in someone else's family matters. Their voices carried a blend of regret and shame, regret for what they had seen, and shame for not acting sooner. Jack thanked them without bitterness, though a quiet heaviness settled deeper inside him as he closed the door behind them. As afternoon light stretched across the living room carpet, Jack sat at the dining table with the stack of documents the officers had left behind. The weight of paperwork felt strangely symbolic. Evidence, statements, timelines, each piece a sharp reminder of truths unfolding too quickly. While sorting through the pile, he came across something that did not belong. A manila envelope bearing the faintest trace of perfume Vanessa favored. Inside it lay a photocopy of a property transfer form, his signature at the bottom so convincingly forged that he almost doubted his own memory. The filing date printed at the top stabbed at him with cruel clarity, 3 days before he had left for his 10-day trip. The listed recipient was not a bank or legal entity, but simply holding for reassignment, and the filing clerk's name had been blacked out in marker, leaving only one identifying detail stamped on the back. Submitted by Vanessa Holt. Jack's breath slowed as he held the paper between his fingers. The edges were crisp, unwrinkled, handled carefully enough to suggest intent rather than accident. It was not the financial value that shook him, nor the fear of losing the home he had worked years to build, but the realization that Vanessa had been planning something far beyond anger or neglect, that the harm done to Emily had not been an emotional outburst, but part of a pattern rooted in secrecy, manipulation, and deception. Rex, lying nearby with his head resting on his paws, lifted his eyes toward Jack, watching the shift in his expression with the intuitive loyalty only a dog like him could offer. The late afternoon shadows lengthened across the yard as Jack placed the forged document flat on the table, the silence around him as steady as the decision forming in his heart. The truth, once uncovered, does not return to darkness easily, and the threads now exposed would have to be followed to their end, wherever that end might lead. Emily, curled against a cushion on the couch, drifted into exhausted sleep while Rex remained close beside her, his quiet vigilance a reminder that not all guardians wear uniforms or speak in words. The house felt different now, not broken but awakening, as if the walls themselves were finally ready to let the truth breathe after being silent for too long. The next morning arrived with a dull, steady brightness over Winterfall Valley, the kind that softened the rooftops but did nothing to ease the weight of a man who had spent the night trying to make sense of the world he thought he understood. Jack Carter stood in the small home office he rarely used, a room filled with service plaques, old field manuals, and a few photographs that once meant pride more than pain. The silence settled thickly around him as he scrolled through the phone records the officers had provided, each unfamiliar number marked with dates when he had been confirmed out on assignments. His brow tightened as he leaned closer, tracing a pattern that felt calculated, deliberate, and deeply personal. One number appeared repeatedly, steady, rhythmic, almost intimate in its consistency, and even before he looked at the name listed, Jack felt a slow chill travel down his spine, the cold recognition that betrayal often wore an ordinary face. When he read the name Dylan Crane, a strange stillness settled in his chest, the kind that came not from shock but from confirmation of an instinct he wished had been wrong. The background file the officers gave him painted a picture that was too neat to be harmless, A 40-year-old man with unremarkable features, a clean-shaven jaw, well-kept brown hair, and clothes that blended into crowds without ever drawing attention. He looked like someone who carried receipts in a tidy wallet and offered polite nods in elevators, yet his history whispered otherwise. He had been linked to schemes targeting retired soldiers, always slipping through legal cracks, always leaving someone else holding debt or forged paperwork. Jack studied Dylan's photograph with the focused calm of someone who had been trained to recognize threats not by volume, but by subtle deviations in behavior. The faint smirk at the corner of Dylan's mouth, the eyes that held no warmth, only calculation. Jack began piecing together the timeline using his own travel logs, bank statements, and small memories he once dismissed as forgettable. Vanessa stepping outside to take calls, always quick to end them when she noticed him watching. Her sudden fascination with saving money by handling all household finances herself. The way she had grown defensive when he asked simple questions, meeting him with half answers and rehearsed irritation. As he sifted through the paperwork, Rex sat near the doorway, his quiet presence a steady counterweight to the storm building in Jack's mind. The dog's ears twitched at every shift in Jack's breathing, as if sensing each realization landing with its own bruising weight. Jack rubbed the bridge of his nose, staring again at the frequency of the calls, and whispered to himself, "How long has this been going on?" The next step came not from paperwork, but from Emily's small, trembling recollections. Later that afternoon, when the officers asked to speak with her again, Jack insisted on being the one to guide the conversation, choosing the living room where daylight could soften the edges of a truth no child should have to hold. Emily sat curled at the end of the couch, hair newly trimmed at the hospital to even out the damage, wearing a small pastel sweater that hung loosely around her thin shoulders. She kept one hand buried in Rex's fur, as if anchoring herself. Jack asked gently, his voice steady, not because he felt calm, but because she needed him to be. And slowly, with pauses filled by the sound of her small breaths, she explained how Vanessa would close her door each time that man, the man with the quiet shoes, she called him, came into the house. She described the low voices drifting down the hallway, the laughter that sounded wrong, and the way Vanessa warned her that coming downstairs would ruin everything. What lingered most painfully in Jack's mind was Emily describing the nights when she could hear papers being handled, papers slapped on the table, pens dragged across pages, and Vanessa whispering in a tone Emily only heard when she was angry. At one point, Emily had peered through the crack of her doorway and seen them sitting close together, closer than family friends should be, their heads bent over a stack of documents. She recalled Vanessa's voice sharp like a snapped twig when she yelled at Emily for being out of her room. Jack listened without interrupting, feeling something inside him tremble with a mix of grief and restrained fury, the kind that made his jaw clench and his hands fold together tightly to keep from shaking. He thanked her softly for telling him and brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek, promising quietly, "You're safe now." As afternoon light shifted to a deeper gold, Jack stepped outside with Rex to clear his thoughts, but it was the dog who redirected the moment entirely. Rex paused near the back fence, nose lifting toward the thin line of trees behind the house. Without hesitation, he pushed through the small gate, looked back once as if calling Jack to follow, and trotted into the narrow stretch of woodland. Jack followed closely, boots pressing into the soft ground, watching Rex lower his head and weave between bushes as if tracking something long buried beneath soil and memory. After a few minutes, the dog stopped beneath a crooked spruce and began pawing the earth with quiet urgency. Jack knelt beside him, brushing away the loose dirt until a flash of color emerged, a toy truck Emily had once carried everywhere. It was scratched, dirty, and half-buried as though hidden intentionally. A few inches deeper he found another toy, a small plush rabbit missing an ear, damp and matted from the soil. Jack sat back on his heels, staring at the items with a hollow ache. These were not just lost, they were removed, taken from a child as punishment, buried where she could not reach them. Rex whined softly, nudging the rabbit closer to Jack's hand, and the veteran placed a steady palm on the dog's head. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the trees shifting just enough to echo the quiet truth. Someone had wished to erase pieces of Emily, piece by piece, day by day, while he was away believing she was loved. Jack held the toys carefully, as though handling something fragile, and felt the painful certainty of how calculated the harm had been. This was not a moment of anger. It was a pattern, a strategy, a stripping down of a child's life to make room for someone else's desires. Back at the house, the evidence grew heavier when the neighbor, Mr. Bloom, knocked gently on the door, hat in hand, expression lined with remorse. He was a man in his late 60s, thin with a stooped posture and the kind of soft voice that suggested he'd spent years trying to avoid conflict. He explained that after hearing the commotion the day before, he had reviewed his driveway camera footage, something he rarely checked, and found a clip he thought Jack needed to see. The video, though grainy, showed Vanessa dragging Emily across the yard by the arm with a force that made the little girl stumble, and the timestamp confirmed Jack had been out of town. Mr. Bloom apologized for not coming forward sooner, his voice wavering with guilt, but Jack placed a firm hand on his shoulder, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement that the truth mattered now more than timing. With the footage added to the growing file, Jack returned to his office with a quiet resolve. He laid everything out on the desk, the phone records, the buried toys, the neighbor's footage, and studied them not as a man angered, but as a soldier assessing a battlefield. He began mapping connections, Vanessa's late-night calls, Dylan's known history, the sudden financial discrepancies, and Emily's fear-laced memories of being confined whenever Dylan arrived. He saw the pattern clearly now. Vanessa and Dylan were not simply reckless, they were strategic. They had been building something in the dark, an escape route paved with Jack's property, his savings, his home, and the cost of that plan was a child's safety and innocence. Jack felt a deep, steadying breath fill his lungs as he looked at the final piece of evidence, the call log showing Vanessa reaching out to Dylan minutes after Jack had left for work on the last day of his trip. The evening settled in quietly, casting long shadows across the room as Jack gathered the evidence into a neat, intentional stack. He felt no need for rage. The truth itself was heavy enough. From the doorway, Emily watched him with wide, searching eyes, and Rex lay at her feet, his steady breathing a gentle reassurance. Jack crossed the room, knelt beside his daughter, and held her small hands in his calloused ones. He didn't tell her everything would be all right, not because he doubted it, but because promises meant something in his world, and he intended to keep this one with actions, not words. For now, all he said was, "No one will ever hurt you again." And Rex, sensing the unspoken vow, shifted closer, resting his head gently on Emily's knee as if sealing the promise in a language older than words. The courthouse of Snow Ridge County stood beneath a pale morning sky, its stone facade catching the faint shimmer of winter sun as if the building itself had seen enough human frailty to protect its own silence. Inside, the air carried that familiar mixture of polished wood, old files, and the quiet murmur of people trying to appear calmer than they felt. Jack Carter walked down the long corridor with Rex steady at his side, the dog's steps measured and vigilant, while Emily clung to Jack's sleeve with the fragile grip of a child who understood far too well why she was there. The waiting room outside courtroom 3 felt like a place where time hesitated, too still, too cold, and heavy with what the next hours might reveal. Jack lowered himself to Emily's level, brushing a hand gently along her small shoulder, reminding her without words that she would not face this room alone. When the hearing began, Vanessa Holt entered with a deliberate slowness, her posture drawn into a shape meant to evoke vulnerability. Slumped shoulders, timid steps, a pale blouse paired with a cardigan chosen to soften her image. Her blonde hair was pulled back loosely, framing a face she had schooled into quiet sorrow, eyes downcast whenever someone looked her way. She sat beside her attorney, a brisk man in his 40s with silver-framed glasses and the clipped tone of someone who believed presentation could outmaneuver truth. Vanessa folded her hands carefully on the table, as if arranging herself into the portrait of a woman wronged rather than a woman exposed. But even in the practiced gentleness of her expression, there was a flicker of calculation that betrayed her. The prosecutor, a steady-voiced woman named Linda Harding, began by laying out the timeline with methodical restraint. She spoke of medical reports, phone records, and financial logs, weaving the evidence with a clarity that cut through the defense's attempt to paint Vanessa as overwhelmed and misunderstood. The photographs of bruises were displayed on the monitor, one by one, each image accompanied by the neutral tone of the attending physician's statements. Vanessa's eyes darted nervously each time a picture appeared, her carefully rehearsed sympathy faltering under the weight of what was no longer deniable. She shifted in her seat, pressing her lips together, unable to hold the courtroom's gaze when Harding emphasized the pattern, the repetition, and the quiet suffering concealed behind closed doors. Jack sat rigidly in the front row, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles blanched. He did not glare or speak. Instead, he held himself with the quiet endurance of a man who had carried truth through storms far harsher than any courtroom could present. Rex rested at his feet, eyes alert, ears pricked whenever the room's tension shifted. Emily sat between them, her small hand buried in Rex's fur, the dog leaning subtly into her touch, as if drawing the fear away from her trembling fingers. Harding called her name gently, inviting her to the stand with the kind of softness people reserved for moments too fragile to mishandle, and the room fell into a hush as the little girl rose from her seat. Emily climbed onto the witness chair with slow, cautious movements, her feet dangling above the floor. Rex remained beside her with the judge's permission, lying quietly against the stand as if forming a protective barrier around her small frame. The judge, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with kind eyes beneath heavy brows, leaned forward slightly, softening his voice to ask if she understood why she was there. Emily nodded, though her chin wobbled, and when Harding gently asked what she wished to say, a silence stretched across the room, thin, taut, almost brittle, until Emily's voice finally rose in a trembling whisper. "I don't want my stepmom to hold the scissors anymore," she said, tears beginning to spill. "I want to live with my dad. And Rex." The simplicity of her plea, uncluttered by adult explanations or legal framing, landed with a gravity no document could match. Harding stepped aside respectfully, allowing the child's words to settle, but Vanessa reacted with a strained, almost desperate shift in posture, leaning toward her attorney as if urging him to intervene. He rose with a rehearsed objection, attempting to steer the narrative toward parental stress and misunderstandings, but each argument wilted under the stark contrast between Emily's innocence and the evidence gathered. The courtroom could feel Vanessa's composure slipping, her breaths sharpening, hands twisting in her lap, as Harding resumed, now unveiling the financial angle. Bank statements appeared on the screen, then the forged property transfer form, followed by the cluster of late-night phone calls tied directly to Dylan Crane. Vanessa's face drained of color, her throat tightening as she glanced toward the back of the room, perhaps hoping for someone to refute what could no longer be reshaped. The arrest of Dylan Crane came next in the prosecutor's orderly presentation. Photos of his capture appeared, Dylan wearing his usual neutral-tone jacket, expression unreadably calm even as handcuffs circled his wrists. Harding explained how he had attempted to leave the state late the previous evening, carrying with him several missing documents from Jack's home, insurance forms, banking details, and a copy of a key Jack hadn't even realized was gone. The officers who caught him described his demeanor as politely detached, the unsettling composure of someone who had long believed he would never face consequences. Harding emphasized the relevance, the pattern, the collusion, the intention. Vanessa shifted in her seat, swallowing hard, her previous performance unraveling as the courtroom saw the full architecture of her betrayal. The defense made one last attempt to salvage her image, calling Vanessa to speak on her own behalf. She dabbed at her eyes with a folded tissue, her voice trembling as she claimed loneliness, misunderstanding, emotional strain. She spoke of being overwhelmed, of trying and failing, of fear and regret. But the judge listened with the measured patience of someone who had heard too many attempts to reshape truth into sympathy. And the prosecutor, when cross-examining, gently but firmly brought her back to the evidence. "If you were overwhelmed," Harding asked with unflinching calm, "why did you attempt to sell a home that wasn't yours? Why did you contact Mr. Crane 37 times in 8 days? Why were these documents found in his possession?" Vanessa faltered, her practiced narrative falling apart beneath the clarity she could not undo. When the time came for the verdict, the courtroom grew still, the kind of deep anticipatory quiet where even breathing felt loud. Emily clutched Rex more tightly, the German shepherd lowering his head protectively, while Jack rested a steady hand on her back, anchoring her with the warmth of his presence. The judge reviewed the charges slowly, his voice resonant but controlled. Child endangerment, physical and emotional abuse, fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, and intimidation of a minor. Each charge felt like a stone placed in its rightful spot. He concluded with a firm, even tone that carried no malice, only the weight of justice. The court sentences Vanessa Holt and Dylan Crane to 20 years in state custody. For a moment the room did not move. Then Emily released a quiet sob, not of fear, but of relief so deep it seemed to lift her small shoulders in a faint shudder. Jack gathered her into his arms, holding her with the care of someone who finally felt the ground stop shifting beneath him. Rex pressed his head against both of them, the dog's warm breath grounding the moment with a silent promise that he would remain her shield, her constant companion, her unspoken comfort. Vanessa was escorted out through the side door, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief, the role she had tried so hard to play dissolving in the bright, unforgiving light of the truth. There was no triumphant cheer, no dramatic scene, just the quiet certainty that justice had finally reached the people who needed it most. As the courtroom emptied, Jack stood for a moment near the windows where the afternoon light spilled across the floor in long, gentle bands. He looked down at his daughter, her small hand clasping Rex's fur with newfound steadiness, and felt a calm he had not known in months, a calm shaped not by forgetfulness, but by the restoration of what mattered. Emily leaned her head against his chest, breathing in slow, exhausted sighs, while Rex sat at their side like a sentry who finally sensed the danger fading. The world outside moved on, cars passing, people talking, life continuing. But inside that moment, there was only a father, a child, and a loyal dog standing quietly, in the warm light of safety reclaimed. The early weeks after the court's decision moved through Winterfall Valley with the soft patience of a season learning to heal itself. And in that gentle stretch of time, Jack Carter found a new rhythm forming within the walls of his home, a rhythm built not on fear or uncertainty, but on the slow rebuilding of trust, safety, and warmth. Morning sunlight returned to the small house with a clarity it had not carried in months, filling each room with a sense of beginning rather than lingering shadows. Emily, still shy in her movements and cautious with certain sounds, started each day wrapped in the quiet reassurance of Rex lying near her bed, his dark coat stretched across the floor like a silent promise that the world beyond the blankets would no longer reach for her with harmful hands. Jack watched from the doorway most mornings, letting the sight root itself into his memory, knowing how hard-fought such peace truly was. Every Wednesday afternoon, Jack drove Emily to a modest therapy office on the far side of town, a small place painted in warm colors, where a licensed child psychologist named Dr. Paige Litton welcomed her with gentle patience. Dr. Litton was a woman in her mid-40s, with soft auburn hair pulled back in a loose bun, round glasses resting on the bridge of her nose, and a voice that carried a calm shaped by years of listening to children speak around their pain. She never rushed Emily, choosing instead to let the girl draw pictures, hold soft toys, or sit quietly until she found words she could trust. Some days Emily spoke only a little. Other days she surprised even herself with the courage tucked inside her small voice. Jack waited in the lobby, hands folded, eyes drifting over magazines he never truly read, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and sorrow as he watched his daughter climb one steady rung at a time out of the fear that had once swallowed her. During the nights, Rex remained a constant sentinel at Emily's bedside, stretched out with his head resting close enough to her small hand that she could touch him without even lifting her arm. Jack often stopped by before turning in, leaning against the doorframe as he watched child and dog breathe in quiet harmony, the soft rustle of blankets and the faint movement of Rex's ears creating a night rhythm that felt almost sacred. Sometimes Emily's sleep carried traces of old nightmares, a twitch, a soft cry, a tightening of her shoulders, and Rex would rise instantly, nose nudging gently against her cheek until her breathing slowed into peaceful steadiness again. Jack rarely intervened during those moments. He simply watched, humbled by the devotion of a creature who had no language for comfort except presence, yet whose presence carried the power of an anchor. As winter loosened its grip and early spring moved in, Jack turned his attention to repairing the home that had once concealed more pain than he ever realized. He replaced light bulbs one by one, choosing warm-toned ones that softened the evenings rather than the harsh white bulbs Vanessa had preferred. He repainted the living room walls a muted sage color, a shade that reminded him of the calm forests he used to hike through after deployments, letting each brushstroke erase a fragment of the life that no longer belonged there. Rex followed him from room to room, tail sweeping softly as he monitored every shift in energy, while Emily often sat cross-legged nearby with crayons in hand, occasionally handing Jack small drawings she claimed were, "So the house doesn't feel sad anymore." With every repaired hinge, fresh coat of paint, and newly polished floorboard, Jack felt the home return not to what it had been, but to what it was meant to be. Out in the yard, where fear had once taken shape under sunlight, Emily began to rediscover her laughter. Her hair, once shorn unevenly, now grew into soft, wavy strands that framed her face in a way that reminded Jack of her mother, a resemblance that caught him off guard sometimes, tugging familiar grief to the surface. She chased Bubbles across the grass, ran with cautious joy along the stone path, and giggled whenever Rex bounded after her with gentle restraint, careful never to knock her down. Jack often sat on the porch steps, arms resting on his knees, letting the sound of her laughter fold into him like a long-awaited blessing. It wasn't that the past disappeared. It was that the present grew strong enough to hold it without breaking. As the household grew sturdier, Jack found himself drawn back toward a responsibility he once carried quietly, the work of supporting fellow veterans who had been targeted by predatory schemes. His own experience with Dylan had sharpened his sense of duty, turning empathy into resolve. He began volunteering at the local Veterans Resource Center again, a humble brick building run by a small team of retired service members who believed in the power of shared stories and practical help. Jack met with men and women who arrived with stacks of confusing paperwork, unexpected debts, or suspicions they could not articulate. His voice, steady and grounded, guided them through the signs he wished he had seen sooner: unusual phone calls, unsolicited financial advice, pressure to sign documents, and strangers who appeared too helpful too quickly. He did not dramatize his own ordeal. He simply used it as a beacon for others who needed someone who understood the quiet ways harm could infiltrate a life. Sometimes Jack brought Rex with him to the center, knowing how the dog's calm presence eased veterans who struggled with anxiety or distrust. Rex would rest beside chairs or gently nudge the hands of those who hesitated to speak. Jack noticed the way people opened up more readily with the dog nearby, how old memories surfaced with slightly less pain when a loyal companion grounded the room. In those moments, Jack realized that healing wasn't a straightforward road, but a shared one that required patience, honesty, and the small, consistent actions that rebuilt dignity. His role wasn't heroic, it was human, shaped by mistakes, insight, and a renewed commitment to protect others from the very pain he had been forced to confront. At home, Emily's progress grew steadily visible. She slept more deeply, hummed softly while drawing, and moved through the house with a confidence she had not shown in months. Jack noticed the shift in her posture, the way she no longer flinched when someone dropped a spoon or closed a door too quickly. He celebrated small milestones with quiet pride: the first time she reached for the front door to play outside without waiting for reassurance, the first time she laughed until she lost her breath, the first time she whispered, "Thank you, Rex," without tears in her voice. Rex accepted each sign of healing with gentle tail wags, leaning into her touch as if content to witness the transformation he had helped make possible. One afternoon, while Jack fixed a loose drawer in the hallway, Emily approached him with a folded sheet of thick white paper tucked behind her back, her expression both shy and proud. She handed it to him without a word, and Jack unfolded it slowly, revealing a crayon drawing that captured the entire journey more truthfully than any spoken account could. 3 figures standing hand in hand under a bright yellow sun. One tall man in an olive jacket, one small girl with soft brown hair, and one German shepherd with his ears perked toward the sky. Above the figures, in uneven but determined letters, were the words, "Me and Dad and Rex." Jack felt his breath falter as the meaning settled into him. Emily tugged at his sleeve, asking quietly if they could hang it somewhere the house could see it, so it would remember that we're safe now. Jack chose the center of the living room wall, placing the drawing in a simple wooden frame before securing it carefully in place. He stepped back, Emily leaning against his leg while Rex sat loyally beside them, and for a long moment the three of them simply looked at the picture as if studying proof of a promise fulfilled. Jack rested his hand on his daughter's head, smoothing her growing hair, and said softly, his voice barely above a whisper but steady with conviction, "I promise you, from now on, you will only ever know safety." Emily nodded, leaning into him, and Rex released a slow, gentle sigh, the kind that spoke of long-kept vigilance finally allowed to rest. In that quiet, sunlit room, where fresh paint met warm light and new memories began to grow, the sense of home returned, not as a place, but as a certainty shared between three hearts learning to breathe freely again. There are moments when stories don't end with applause, but with a quiet breath, the kind that reminds us how precious gentleness can be. In every act of courage, there are hands we never see, hearts that never ask for recognition, and souls who carry light into places the world has forgotten. Maybe kindness isn't a grand gesture after all. Maybe it's simply staying, protecting, forgiving, and beginning again. Somewhere tonight, another child will sleep more peacefully, another dog will wait faithfully at the foot of a bed, and another man or woman will choose to do good without needing anyone to notice. If this story touched something in you, take a moment to share your thoughts below. Your words might reach someone who needs to remember that goodness still exists. Subscribe to stay with us for more true stories that speak softly but linger deeply. May God bless every heart that still believes in compassion.